the early decades of the 20th century, science stood at the center of European pride. Microscopes, test tubes, and new medical frontiers promised the future, a world where disease could be cured and the human body itself could be perfected. But beneath that optimism, something darker began to take shape. It wasn't a monster born in secret laboratories. It was an idea, one that whispered that not all lives were equal. Long before the name Josef Mengele was known, Europe was already obsessed with the concept of biological destiny. In universities across Germany, Britain, and the United States, scholars spoke of racial hygiene, hereditary health, and the dream of improving the human race through selective breeding. They called it eugenics, from the Greek, meaning well-born. It sounded noble. It was anything but. By the 1920s, eugenic theories had entered mainstream thought. Doctors published studies ranking intelligence by skull size. Psychiatrists argued that poverty, crime, and illness were inherited traits, and governments began to act on those claims. In the United States, thousands of people, labeled as feeble-minded, unfit, or degenerate, were forcibly sterilized. American courts upheld it as lawful. One Supreme Court justice famously wrote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." That line would later appear in Nazi textbooks as evidence that the world agreed with their vision. Germany, meanwhile, had a long history of medical excellence. Anatomy, bacteriology, and physiology were national prides. But when the Nazi Party rose to power in 1933, science became something new, a political weapon. Hitler's ideology depended on pseudoscience to justify itself. He needed data, doctors, and a system that could label millions as unworthy of life. And German medicine, once guided by the Hippocratic Oath, was retooled to serve racial policy. In the very first months of Nazi rule, laws were passed ordering the sterilization of anyone deemed genetically inferior. Schizophrenics, epileptics, people with physical disabilities, the deaf, the blind, even alcoholics. By 1939, over 400,000 people had been sterilized under medical supervision. Every form signed, every incision made carried a physician's signature. This was not the work of fringe fanatics. It was the medical establishment, professors, researchers, and hospital directors, people who once studied anatomy and microbiology. Were now measuring racial value. They used calipers to measure skulls. They charted the color of eyes and hair. They compiled data that claimed to prove Aryan superiority, and behind the numbers was a growing conviction that medicine could cleanse the human race. At the center of this movement stood the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, one of the most prestigious scientific organizations in the world. It had branches for anthropology, genetics, and brain research. Its directors received state funding and international recognition. They spoke at conferences, published in respected journals, and trained a generation of young scientists. One of them was Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer, a charismatic geneticist whose research focused on one subject, twins. He believed twins held the key to heredity, 2 lives born from the same origin, offering a natural laboratory for understanding how traits were passed down. His experiments were still theoretical, limited to observation and statistics. But in the ideology of the Third Reich, his studies carried enormous promise. If heredity could be measured, it could also be controlled. In his lectures, von Verschuer spoke of racial purity not as myth, but as biology. He described genes as a battlefield, where healthy German stock must be defended from degenerative influences. Students admired him. Among them was a young doctor from Bavaria named Josef Mengele. Mengele was born in 1911 in the small German town of Günzburg, near the Danube River. His father owned a manufacturing company that produced farm equipment. Strict, Catholic, disciplined. The family valued order and ambition. Joseph was the eldest son, and by all accounts, gifted. He excelled in school, particularly in biology and anatomy. Teachers described him as intelligent, articulate, and unusually curious about human differences. After high school, he studied medicine at the University of Munich, one of Germany's leading institutions. But he wasn't satisfied with medicine alone. He wanted to understand what made people different. That curiosity led him to anthropology, the study of human origins and race. He pursued both fields simultaneously, earning doctorates in physical anthropology and medicine. His first thesis, written under the supervision of Professor Theodore Mollison, analyzed the structure of human jaws. It was dry, technical, and full of measurements. But beneath the statistics was the idea that racial identity could be quantified. When the Nazis came to power, Mengele's career path aligned perfectly with the regime's goals. He joined the National Socialist German Doctors League, and in 1937, he became an assistant to Ottmar von Verschuer at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. There, he immersed himself in genetics, twin studies, and racial theory. By then, Nazi medicine had already crossed from theory to murder. In secret facilities across Germany, doctors were killing patients deemed incurably ill. They called it euthanasia. The victims were gassed, injected, or starved. Their organs were sent to universities for research. Doctors wrote reports on how efficiently their methods worked. They called it medical progress. These programs, known as Action T4, became the blueprint for the death camps that followed. The techniques used in psychiatric hospitals were later scaled up for industrial killing, and many of the doctors who participated in T4 would later serve in camps like Dachau, Treblinka, and Auschwitz. Josef Mengele followed this transformation with fascination. He saw in it not horror, but opportunity, the chance to study human biology in ways that ordinary laboratories could not. He wasn't alone. Across Germany, the lines between science and ideology were dissolving. Medical schools taught racial hygiene. Textbooks defined Jews as biologically inferior. Children learned to identify races by measuring noses and skulls. By the late 1930s, the union of medicine and Nazism was complete. Doctors became soldiers in a biological war. Their tools were scalpels, not rifles. Their targets were human lives. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the conquest was not only territorial, it was scientific. Every occupied region was surveyed for racial composition. Anthropologists measured local populations, categorized ethnic groups, and sent reports to Berlin. Science had become a bureaucracy of blood. Josef Mengele, still under von Verschuer, volunteered for military service. In 1940, he joined the Waffen-SS, serving first as a medical officer on the Eastern Front. He was wounded in action and decorated for bravery. His comrades described him as calm, disciplined, and composed under pressure. Those traits, efficiency, politeness, intellect, would later make him one of the most terrifying figures of the Holocaust. After recovering from his injuries, Mengele returned to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. But his ambitions had grown. He no longer wanted to study heredity in a classroom. He wanted subjects, large samples, human material. In 1943, von Verschuer recommended him for reassignment to a special research position within the SS Medical Corps. The location, Auschwitz. To Berlin, it was another bureaucratic appointment, a skilled doctor sent to oversee research in a concentration camp. To history, it was the moment when science itself crossed the final line. When Josef Mengele stepped off the train at Auschwitz II-Birkenau in May 1943, he carried not just medical instruments, but an entire philosophy, one that fused anatomy with ideology and reason with cruelty. He saw himself not as a killer, but as a scientist at the frontier of discovery. What he would do next would stain the history of medicine forever. When Josef Mengele arrived at Auschwitz in May 1943, he was 32 years old, educated, decorated, well-spoken, and precisely the kind of man the SS wanted to represent its new order. To the outside world, Auschwitz was a labor camp. In reality, it was the center of the final solution, the industrialized destruction of Europe's Jews. More than 1 million people would die there. And at the heart of that machine stood a network of doctors, all sworn to serve the Reich's idea of medicine. Mengele's assignment placed him under the authority of the camp's chief medical officer, Dr. Eduard Wirtz. Officially, his duties were administrative, to monitor hygiene, prevent disease outbreaks. and inspect arriving transports. In practice, those duties meant selections, deciding who would live and who would die. The process was simple. When a train arrived, its passengers were lined up on the platform, men to one side, women and children to the other. Doctors, wearing white coats, stood in front of them. With a single motion of the hand, they sent people either to the camp or to the gas chambers. Witnesses remembered Mengele for his composure. He smiled often. He greeted prisoners politely, even with a touch of charm. His uniform was immaculate, and in his hand, a riding crop, which he used not to strike, but to point. There was no hesitation, no visible conflict. To him, this was efficiency. He believed he was fulfilling his duty as a doctor, preserving those who were fit, removing those who were not. The selections could last hours. Trains arrived day and night, sometimes 10,000 people in a single day. And through it all, Mengele's voice remained calm, his gestures precise. He kept records. He took notes on twins, on dwarfs, on those with physical deformities. For him, Auschwitz was not chaos. It was opportunity. The SS had already authorized medical research inside concentration camps. At Dachau, doctors tested hypothermia and high-altitude exposure on prisoners. At Ravensbrück, women were used to study wound infections. At Buchenwald, inmates were injected with typhus and poisons. But Auschwitz offered something unprecedented: scale. Hundreds of thousands of human beings, classified, registered, and disposable. For a researcher like Mengele, obsessed with heredity, it was the largest genetic sample ever assembled. He quickly established his own research station inside Block 10, later moving to Block 14 at Birkenau. There, he built a network of prisoner assistants: doctors, nurses, pathologists, and clerks. They were Jews and Poles, many of them professionals who cooperated because it meant survival. Among them was Dr. Miklos Niesli, a Hungarian Jewish physician who would later record in precise detail what he witnessed. Niesli described Mengele as methodical, courteous, and disturbingly rational. He maintained strict order, demanded cleanliness, and showed genuine interest in his subjects. But behind that facade was complete moral detachment. Patients were not people. They were specimens. He selected twins from the arriving transports. Boys, girls, sometimes as young as 3 or 4. They were placed in special barracks known as the Twin Block. They received extra food, medical attention, and even small privileges. To the other prisoners, they looked like the lucky ones. They weren't. Every few days, Mengele or his assistants would conduct examinations, blood samples, x-rays, eye color analysis, genital measurements. He recorded everything. He compared weights, growth rates, reactions to disease. He was searching for patterns, genetic links that could explain racial traits. When one twin died, the other was immediately killed so their organs could be compared. The corpses were dissected, the tissues preserved in jars, labeled with numbers and initials. The data was sent back to Berlin, to Ottmar von Verschuer at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. There, in clean laboratories, researchers studied the results, often without asking where the samples came from. Science had become an echo chamber of murder. It is easy to picture Josef Mengele as a caricature, a deranged scientist, a maniac in a white coat, obsessed with cruelty. But the truth is far colder. He was not insane. He was disciplined, charming, articulate, and utterly convinced of his moral purpose. He believed that by studying racial difference, he was serving progress, that through genetics and anatomy, he could help build a stronger, purer humanity. In his mind, Auschwitz was not a crime scene. It was a laboratory, a frontier of knowledge, sanctioned by the state and purified by ideology. Survivors often recalled how polite he was. He smiled, he joked, he spoke softly, sometimes even kindly. A mother would hear him compliment her child's eyes. So blue, so perfect. Before he turned and sent them to the gas chamber. It was that calmness that frightened people most. Evil without rage, precision without empathy. Vera Kriegel, who was 10 when she and her twin sister arrived at Auschwitz, remembered how he called them his special children. She said, He was always polite, always smiling. Then one morning, they took my sister away. When she came back, her eyes were different colors. Mengele had injected dyes into them, an attempt to change iris pigmentation, part of a larger effort to understand and perhaps manipulate Aryan traits. He recorded everything: blood type, head circumference, bone density, lung capacity. He drew blood until children fainted. He infected them with diseases to compare immune responses. When they died, he dissected them, sometimes personally, to trace how illness had spread. This was medicine stripped of its soul. Precision turned into instrument of death. Yet, he did not act alone. Mengele's cruelty was supported by a system, a machine built by the SS that made murder bureaucratic. Every experiment had a file, a report, a code. Data from the camps traveled to universities in Berlin, Munich, and Frankfurt. Professors cited them in papers, not knowing, or pretending not to know, where they came from. Auschwitz was not only a place of killing, it was a network of research units: typhus vaccine studies, sterilization experiments, nutritional analyses. Mengele oversaw the section on human genetics, the study of hereditary disease, deformity, and twin physiology. On paper, it looked like legitimate science. Only the methods were secret. The SS rewarded him. Promotions came quickly. He lived in a comfortable house near the camp, attended small concerts, read Goethe in the evenings. To his colleagues, he was cultured, a doctor devoted to knowledge. To his victims, he was the angel of death. As the war dragged on and Germany began to crumble, Auschwitz became even more deadly. By 1944, transports arrived daily from Hungary, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece. Trains filled with families, tens of thousands every week. The crematoria ran day and night, smoke spreading across the plain. Mengele's notebooks filled with new numbers. He ordered dissections of pregnant women, tests on sterilization by radiation, and comparative autopsies between diseased and healthy subjects. He worked alongside other camp physicians, men like Dr. Horst Schumann, to develop techniques that could sterilize entire populations. And still he kept the manners of a gentleman. He whistled waltzes from The Merry Widow as he walked through the barracks. He demanded cleanliness, punctuality, and precise handwriting, even when the floor was slick with blood. In his notes, one phrase appeared again and again: zum Nutzen der Wissenschaft, for the benefit of science. By late 1944, the Reich was collapsing. Soviet troops were approaching from the east. The SS began burning records, dismantling laboratories, shipping specimens back to Germany. Mengele saw the end coming, but he did not stop. He ordered that his files, organs, and skull samples be preserved. The work must continue, he told his assistants. When the Red Army entered Auschwitz in January 1945, they found the twin barracks empty. On the tables, jars filled with organs, notebooks soaked in chemicals, piles of children's shoes beside scalpels. The Soviets photographed everything. Each image told the same story. The tools of healing had become instruments of death. By then, more than 1,500 pairs of twins had passed through Mengele's hands. Fewer than 200 survived. Mengele himself vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe. The man who once walked calmly through the ramp now disappeared into smoke and rumor, his white coat replaced by a soldier's disguise. He would never stand trial. But the empire of medicine that empowered him, and the idea that science could exist without conscience, would haunt the world forever. Yet one question remained, echoing long after the camps fell. How did a doctor sworn to heal come to see murder as medicine? To answer that, we must return to the moment he first arrived in Auschwitz. The spring of 1943 arrived with the sound of retreat. German armies were falling back from the east. Cities lay in ruins. The Reich was bleeding, but its machinery of death still worked flawlessly. As bombs fell on Berlin, new barracks rose in Poland. Genocide no longer depended on victory. It had become its own momentum. And into that momentum stepped one man, Josef Mengele, freshly appointed SS physician, carrying the credentials of a scientist and the conviction of a believer. Auschwitz-Birkenau stretched before him like an industrial city of suffering. Rows of wooden huts, barbed wire, floodlights, and smoke that stained the sky. At its center, the ramp, a line of steel that split the camp in two, where trains arrived day and night, loaded with human cargo. Each train carried families from every corner of Europe, Hungary, France, Greece, Italy. They stepped out with suitcases, passports, and hope. They thought they had come to work, but the signs were lies, and the air already carried the truth. There, waiting at the platform, stood Mengele, white gloves, clipboard in hand. A motion of the wrist, left or right, decided the rest of a life. Left, labor. Right, the gas. He smiled as he worked, calm, polite, efficient. To the prisoners, he seemed composed, almost kind. To his superiors, he was perfect, disciplined, reliable, unflinching. He embodied the SS ideal, the doctor who could kill without hatred. Auschwitz was not chaos. It was administration. Every step had its form, its record, its number. Trains were logged, selections noted, deaths counted, even murder had a schedule. The SS called it processing. Mengele admired its precision, the idea that destruction could be organized, that horror could be managed like a hospital ward. To him, this was progress, science serving destiny. His duties soon expanded. He became chief physician of the so-called Gypsy family camp, where more than 20,000 Roma and Sinti were confined. He cataloged faces, measured skulls, recorded blood types, searching for a pattern that confirmed his racial theories. When the camp was liquidated in 1944, his final report contained only one word: terminated. Those who saw him remembered contradictions. He could tilt a child's chin upward with a gloved hand and send them to their death a moment later. He asked questions gently, almost like a teacher, yet every answer was written in a notebook that served murder. For Mengele, Auschwitz was not a descent into madness. It was a career. He wrote to mentors, requested equipment, filled out reports. He treated the camp as a research institute, and himself as a man of science. But behind that professionalism lay the true secret of Auschwitz. It did not survive on rage. It survived on order, on men who believed they were merely doing their jobs, on doctors who mistook precision for morality. As 1944 drew to a close, the Reich began to collapse. Files were burned, evidence buried, rail lines destroyed, and yet Mengele continued his work, measuring, dissecting, documenting, as if the war outside no longer existed. When the Red Army finally reached Auschwitz, they found empty barracks, scattered papers, and the silence of what had been called research. Mengele was gone. Only his records remained, numbers without names, organs without bodies, and a question that history would never stop asking. How could men trained to heal become instruments of extermination? Near the women's sector of Birkenau stood two wooden barracks, Block 10 and Block 32. From the outside, they looked ordinary: barred windows, reinforced doors, a sign reading Sonderabteilung, special section. Inside, the air smelled of alcohol and disinfectant. Tables gleamed under harsh light, metal trays, glass jars filled with preserved organs, charts pinned to the walls, measurements of skulls, eyes, limbs. It was called the anthropological department, but among the prisoners, it had another name: the place where people didn't come back. Every morning, twins were marched in pairs across the yard, identical striped uniforms, wooden clogs echoing on the floor. Guards called them Die Versuchskinder, the experiment children. They lined up silently, waiting. Then he appeared, Josef Mengele. Behind him trailed his assistants, doctors, nurses, prisoner orderlies. He greeted them politely, as if they were colleagues. One of them, Dr. Miklos Niesli, later wrote, "He moved like a man completely in control. He spoke kindly, as though addressing patients, not victims. That was the illusion. What took place here looked like medicine. Files, charts, measurements, observations. Each child assigned a number, each drop of blood carefully labeled, every twin treated identically, same food, same bed, same conditions. But the purpose was comparison. If one twin fell ill, the other became the control. If one died, the other was killed for dissection. He called it controlled observation. The SS called it research. The children called it hell. Blood was drawn daily, sometimes half a liter at a time. Children fainted, pale and trembling, while he noted results in neat handwriting. Samples were sent to Berlin to his mentor, Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer, who requested blood and tissue from twin experiments. The correspondence was official. The science, an illusion, because none of it was discovery, only repetition, cruelty disguised as procedure. He searched for patterns that did not exist, chasing theories born from ideology, not evidence. Every result was predetermined. Every experiment, a ritual of obedience. The range of his studies defied reason. He injected dyes into children's eyes, hoping to create the blue of the Aryan ideal. He transfused blood between twins. He infected one with disease to observe the other's death. He amputated limbs without anesthesia, dissected organs to weigh their difference. When one twin died, the other followed, for symmetry. Heart of twin, A, 130 grams. Heart of twin B, 132. He dictated calmly. For him, death was data. He published nothing, but sent reports to Berlin describing his subjects as specimens, cases, types. The word human never appeared. And yet, in the world that made him, this was legitimate science. His lab was clean, his paperwork immaculate, his hierarchy intact. Funding came regularly. Supplies were approved. His mentor cited his field results in academic correspondence. It was not madness that enabled him. It was recognition. The Reich rewarded his precision. It gave the angel of death his wings. Among his victims were two Romanian twins, Ava and Miriam Moses, 10 years old. He measured them daily, drew blood, injected substances of unknown composition. Ava grew sick with fever and paralysis. Miriam's kidneys stopped developing. Both survived. Barely. Years later, Eva recalled, he smiled when he gave orders that killed people. That's what made him terrifying. By the war's end, more than 1,500 pairs of twins had passed through his hands. Fewer than 200 survived. He continued working until the final days of the camp. Even as bombs fell, he filled out data sheets and sealed jars for shipment. When the SS ordered evacuation, he packed his instruments and fled, still wearing his white coat, still speaking of unfinished experiments. When the Soviets entered Auschwitz, they found fragments, slides, charts, preserved specimens, scattered notebooks describing twin pair 621. On one page, a final line, further verification required upon post-war continuation. There would be no continuation. After the war, investigators searched for his research, hoping it might have value. They found nothing usable. The data were chaotic, corrupted, meaningless. The only thing they proved was how far intellect can fall without conscience. Dr. Nyiszli later testified. He destroyed the meaning of medicine. He showed that knowledge without ethics becomes murder. Mengele vanished before he could be tried. His documents, his specimens, his numbers, they survived him. Silent evidence of a system that made death look like science. In the years that followed, doctors and philosophers searched for an answer. How could men trained to heal become instruments of extermination? The answer lay not in hatred, but in obedience, in paperwork, in the comfort of method. In Mengele's lab, every instrument was clean, every record precise, every act justified. It was not a failure of reason. It was reason itself, stripped of morality, functioning perfectly. When survivors spoke decades later, they didn't remember the data. They remembered his voice, calm, polite, the voice of a man who believed he was doing good while standing in the center of hell. The empire that built Auschwitz was crumbling. Its cities lay in ruins, its armies scattered. its leaders hiding in bunkers that smelled of gasoline and defeat. Yet inside the camp, amid the snow and smoke, routine refused to die. Selections continued. The whistles still blew. And in the barracks, where twins once waited for the sound of boots, the doctor still arrived each morning with his clipboard, his gloves, his calm. When the Red Army drew near, others fled in panic. Mengele remained steady. Witnesses would later remember him standing by the ramp, posture erect, shoes polished, eyes scanning faces as if the Reich were eternal. Around him, the crematoria burned not from invasion, but from the SS themselves, erasing their own crimes before the witnesses arrived. Smoke rose from the chimneys like a final confession. In a laboratory drawer lay a single notebook. The last line was unfinished. Further verification will be required under post-war conditions. He had written it hours before leaving. It was the final sentence of Josef Mengele, the scientist. Then came the exodus. Prisoners were forced into the snow, columns of bones marching westward. Those too weak to move shot where they fell. Mengele joined the caravan of fleeing officers, a truck behind him filled with boxes marked medical material. Inside, organs in formalin, sketches of twins, blood charts, autopsy slides. He told an assistant, "These are the future of genetics. They must be preserved." He believed it. Even in the ruins, he believed. The Reich collapsed, and with it, every shield of authority. Yet Mengele moved easily through the wreckage, like a man walking through smoke he himself had made. He shed his uniform, took the name Fritz Hollmann, then Helmut Gregor, then something else. Every disguise was a layer between himself and the mirror. For a brief time, he was detained, a doctor, polite, well-spoken, then released. The paperwork matched. The angel of death was free. Germany turned to ashes. Its architects became refugees, its doctors ghosts. Mengele drifted from town to town, living in barns that smelled of hay and guilt. He worked on farms, mended fences, kept his head low. His family in Günzburg sent money in silence. They did not ask questions. Silence was inheritance. In 1949, he slipped across the Alps and boarded a ship bound for Argentina. Buenos Aires shimmered in the southern sun. A city of exiles, a place where the past arrived wearing new names. The docks smelled of coffee and salt. The air carried German, Italian, Spanish, and denial. He called himself Helmut Gregor, a mechanic from South Tyrol. He rented a small apartment near Palermo Street where ceiling fans hummed above long dinners and soft music. He opened a business importing tools, attended dances, swam in the Rio de la Plata. In photographs from that time, he smiles faintly, a man who seems harmless, even gentle. But in notebooks found years later, the same handwriting returned. The principles remained sound. It was politics that failed, not science. His faith had not broken, only its uniform had changed. In the cafes of Buenos Aires, old comrades whispered names. Eichmann, Priebke, Barbie, all hiding in plain sight. They toasted the old days, laughed at the stupidity of tribunals, clinked glasses over the ghosts of millions. They believed time would bury them. And for a while, it did. Then came 1960. The world remembered. Adolf Eichmann was captured by the Mossad and flown to Israel in a crate marked diplomatic cargo. For a moment, justice felt possible. Mengele read the headlines in silence. That night he packed 2 suitcases and disappeared again. Someone had warned him, perhaps a friend, perhaps a rumor. By dawn, he had crossed into Paraguay. There he lived under his own name. Dr. Josef Mengele, landowner. The dictator Stroessner welcomed him. The past was profitable. On his ranch, he kept horses, books, and a gun near the bed. He wrote letters to his son, signed Father Gregor. The handwriting never shook. He aged well, ate well, slept little, but the circle tightened. Newspaper clippings began printing his face. The angel of death, they said, words that stuck like a scar. He became a rumor in every German voice abroad, a shape glimpsed in every crowd. When someone vanished into the jungle, villagers whispered, "He is here." He moved again, deeper south, into Brazil. Two families, the Stammers and the Bosserts, sheltered him. They called him Dr. Fausto. He treated their neighbors for free. Cuts, coughs, childbirth. A good man, they said. Courteous, quiet. They did not see the tremor in his hand when children laughed. At night, he burned his letters. He refused to sleep near windows. The man who once commanded life and death now flinched at a knock on the door. Every thunderstorm felt like boots approaching. By the 1970s, he was old, broken by blood pressure and regret he never named. The past had outlived him. He went swimming often. The water was the only place he could be weightless. On a February afternoon in 1979, he walked into the sea at Bertioga, Brazil. The waves were calm. He took a few strokes, then vanished beneath the surface. When they pulled him out, his face was peaceful. His heart had failed, or the sea had taken pity. They buried him under another name, Wolfgang Gerhard. No police, no priest, no ceremony, just the sound of shovels and the red earth of Brazil. For 6 years, the world believed he was still alive, hiding in the jungles, plotting experiments, haunting the living. But when his grave was found in 1985, the truth arrived like a cold wind. The angel of death had drowned alone at 67. He escaped judgment, but not memory. History looked at him not as a monster, but as a mirror. Because Mengele was never madness, he was method. The nightmare came not from chaos, but from logic pursued without mercy. That was his true legacy. Not a single discovery, not one advancement, only the demonstration that intellect without conscience becomes annihilation. Every code of ethics written after the war, the Nuremberg Code, the Helsinki Declaration, carries his ghost between its lines. Every researcher who signs informed consent does so in the shadow of his name. And yet, what remains most haunting is not his science, but his silence. The children he measured are gone. The records he burned are gone. The beach that swallowed him has long forgotten his footprints. But his story endures, because it is not about him alone. It is about us, about the moment when knowledge turned its face away from humanity. And the question that still lingers, whispered through the corridors of every laboratory, every courtroom, every generation that swears it would have done better. What happens when science loses its soul?